We've become experts in remote first practices by helping these engineering teams think about how they not only onboard, but set their remote teams for long term embedded success. We also have learned a lot working with clients like GitHub, Cloudflare, and Envision, clear leaders in sort of building mature remote first practices. As an example, Envision, an Andela customer, has proven it is not only possible as a 100% remote organization, but also necessary to be remote first to take highly collaborative processes like ideation and brainstorming and design to build an even better product. This took being intentional about their teams, culture, and also the team's practices and the tools that they are also investing in as they themselves build a tool to have better balance for productivity, but also ways to create health and fun in their work culture. So, how do you design towards remote first? With the COVID lockdowns, most companies simply recreated their in-person experience online. The processes were simply replicated for remote, so a standing meeting just moved to a remote standing meeting. And if anything, you will likely talk to your teams and they will be speaking about being really burnt out because replication has also become quite tenuous. To evolve, I spoke about needing to design. You need to think about the structures and processes that need to evolve to benefit your teams culturally and productively, and how this impacts not only performance, but also gives you a competitive advantage. Formalization is the implementation part. You need to develop a remote work philosophy, embed this into your organizational culture, use it as a way of expressing your values and in the ways of working in person, how you get through discourse and how you celebrate recognition, really thinking about what changes need to be made. Maturity, which is where some of our clients are, is where you start to see the competitive advantage. And oftentimes, this is where your team is working better as a remote and asynchronous team rather than an in person team. So, how do you do this? I would love to hear what you have done with your teams. Here are some organizational shifts we often guide our clients and engineers as they ramp from in person to remote settings. First is mindset. Moving in from this notion of popping in or walking in to one of self service and one that is applied as a shared learning mindset. Where and how do you share information so others can access it? How do you build the organizational muscle for over communicating and seeking feedback? Culture, moving from that water cooler interaction or the barbecues, the happy hours, to kind of figure out how that shows up in a remote community, driven by where and how you recognize your teams. How do you let the teams create fun? How do you let them create team bonding? How do you remind them that at the end of the day, we're all human? How do you build empathy and spaces for common interests? For process, we're so engineered for in person and face to face conversations. So, how do you think about the frameworks and the tools that exist that allow for detailed communication and over communication? Structural. This means moving away from the need to collaborate synchronously to asynchronously, using tools like Loom, Envision, Miro. This may not work for rapid development cycles or all cycles. Some spikes do require you to be synchronous. But how often are you doing this versus building or iterating? And what really is the more common experience for your team? Now, there are four main work streams that we recommend as you're thinking about applying any of these shifts, organizational shifts. And with each one, there needs to be a problem statement that will really differ given your organization stage and context. I will only deep dive into culture and productivity, but for performance, the problem statement could be how do we build high performing teams that contribute to our business goals? And how do we evaluate their ability to contribute to those business goals remotely versus previously in person? For structure, this could be what policies will support building a remote environment where your teams are set up for success, feel included, and are able to drive business results. Next, I'll share some practical ways to think about the culture and productivity work streams. For culture, the problem statement could be how do we build and sustain our culture in a remote environment? How will culture scale in our new remote first world? Some quick wins might be a social committee with diverse representation that can really try and create experiences remotely. Others might be tools like Donut, and Akinsola will speak a little bit about his experience with it, which automatically and randomly connects employees. Or Slack channels for interest groups, either ERGs or activity interest groups. But it's really important that in the framework for that work stream, you're also thinking about the manager mindset. How are you asking your managers to change in their behavior when it comes to building culture? One thing is that culture is led from the top, but it is built from the bottom up. And that is a really important one. So allow and encourage your teams to connect organically. Culture applies all the time, whether it's in a one on one or a company wide event. And that really has to be practiced. Then it's thinking about this in the context of long term or in scale. Because culture must be experienced as important whether it is your day one or day 1000, and must also apply whether your size is 1 or 1000. It is sometimes hard to think about this in the context of scaling, and certainly at Andela, we've experienced the good and the bad and the ugly in relation to scaling culture as a remote organization. But one of the key points to make is employees must always feel empowered to build the culture they need. If driven only by leadership, it will become completely fractured. Track and be open about employee health and engagement, and create tactical plans to address any issues that are raised. For productivity, and I'll go through this very quickly, some quick wins must be no agenda, no attender. How are you setting the purpose of the need to have an in person meeting? Set up the outcomes, be very clear on what success would look like for that meeting. Send as much as you can ahead of time so that the live time is actually productive time. And make sure it's not always productivity type meetings, but also that you're setting up time for creativity and innovation and also fun. The manager mindset and idea here might be, how are you better understanding your team's personal needs? How are you adjusting your expectations to cater for people that are parents, for people who are caregivers, for time zone changes? So, how are you really applying the ability to have asynchronous communication that allows people to work whenever they can work, provided that they are able to ultimately produce? All right, so now how can we think about this in the context of a live lived experience? We're going to shift gears and hear directly from one of our engineers. Welcome, Akinsola. Why don't you start with introducing yourself? Akinsola, are you still there? Akinsola? Oh dear. You may need to mute and unmute. Akinsola? Um, I'll give it one more minute. Otherwise, if you've got questions and are able to hear me, because I'm sort of presenting on faith, please do ask any questions in the what's on your mind. Do you have experiences of how your organization is thinking about being remote first? Lessons you've learned in the course of doing so. I can show them. There you are. I see you. Now, are you able to unmute? You're frozen. Ah. Akinsola, maybe I'm going to ask you to try one more time, but others I'm going to have to speak on your behalf. But are there any questions from those of you that are in the room? Yeah, this is not going to work, I don't think. Dima, thank you for confirming that you can hear and see me. That's great because I think in the earlier sections we did have some technical difficulties. Well, I don't know when everyone's joined, but I've been presenting at this notion of we're all remote now. We're likely going to stay all remote. It's important for us to think about being remote first. This is a very intentional design exercise. And I'm curious to hear how you and your organizations are considering this, especially in the space of how does that create culture and productivity that gives you a competitive advantage, and how you and your organizations are thinking about this. Please do make it interactive. Add your thoughts in the what's on your mind section. Akinsola, we're not having any success with your mute. Just see if that helps. Um, Dima, as someone who's texted in the last few, maybe by way of typing, I don't know how to unmute you if I could. Um, is your organization staying remote? Akinsola, you're still frozen. I can see you're really trying, but you're still quite frozen. Anybody that's 100% gone back to the office, or any companies that have made the commitment to staying all remote? All right. Okay. I think we might have better luck. Can we just do a quick mic check? Okay. Is anyone else able to hear Akinsola? Because I cannot. Oh dear. All right, Akinsola, at the point you're back, just go ahead and interrupt me. I will maybe give them a sense of who you were and what we were going to share as, as related to your experience. And that way we don't have to waste too much more time. So Akinsola Akinwale is based out of Nigeria. He's a senior software engineer with over 10 years experience as a back-end engineer. And he's worked for companies like IBM, Next Generation Systems, and Vast Systems in Nigeria as well. Since he joined Andela, he's been embedded with a US based data science and media technology company that is remote and spread between Singapore and Seattle. This company is called Media Ocean. They are providing a self-service platform for large enterprises to manage their digital advertising, purchasing, accounting, communication, and other services. They handle over 130 billion in advertising spending and have about 1,000 employees. And so while they were co-located in certain cities in the US, the engineering and the data science and media technology teams are spread between Singapore and Seattle. So they were not, it was not new to them to be remote and distributed, but there still was heavy emphasis around their co-located offices. Before the pandemic, those offices were Seattle and Chicago. And so I'm going to give it one more try and see if we can get Akinsola. I don't think we can. So I'm just going to continue sharing for you a little bit about his experience. So typically, when he starts his day, he looks at Jira to get a better sense of what tasks were completed, what tasks, if anything, were assigned to him, get a better sense of any documentation updates that were provided. He's also checking Slack as the main tool for communication between their teams. So, this is again an expression of how you can be leveraging your technologies to allow for asynchronous communication. But that gives him a better sense of how he needs to organize his day. His team does have scheduled stand-ups, but they're really focusing on creating the accountability about what needs to get done in their workday, but then also where they can support each other in terms of unblocking. And so that sort of speaks to how they are over communicating, but also setting up status and task, which is around productivity. When I asked Akinsola about, well, how about fun? How does that get done? And even before fun, how did they onboard you so that you, as a member of the Andela Engineering Talent Network, were able to feel like you were part of this team of 1,000? And said that they had really organized a lot of their documentation. So he was able to self-serve in terms of onboarding, but they also were able to trigger for key team members their ability to welcome him. And so they were welcoming themselves on Slack to him and then giving the context around what might they be able to unblock from him, and then what are the one-on-one sessions that they were going to need to schedule in order to make sure that he was fully up to speed with the documentation he was reading on GitHub. But then that welcoming sort of made him feel like he was part of the team. And he was able to very quickly begin to collaborate, seek answers, and feel as a member of the team. One thing we did talk about was the culture, and he said that the company culture is one of inclusion and openness. He felt that even as he was working remotely and as the only team member that is in Africa, he feels like he's a member of their 1,000-person global team. They use tools like Donut. I mentioned that earlier, and not as a plug for that specific one, but certainly for the functionality of being able to randomly connect people in the organization. Just last week, he met someone that is in the enterprise activation team, someone who had, for pre-pandemic, moved from Florida to Chicago, only to now be working remotely and considering where she should be working from. But he was able to learn a little bit more about other parts of the business in a way that, again, if you're only replicating what you do in the office, it might get lost when you move to remote. They also have heavy emphasis on recognition and celebration, and they're using tools like Seven Geese to give shout outs and celebrate birthdays and just sort of really create the relevant noise around just being human and having noteworthy milestones. They also have frequent yet optional sessions, so it's not all forced fun, that allow the teams to just be human, whether it's yoga, whether it's art and drawing, or whether it's just the ability to celebrate what the company has accomplished. And lastly, we spoke a little bit about, okay, that's all fine and good. He was onboarded, he felt like he was part of the team. There are ways that he can express himself within the organization. But what does this ultimately mean for productivity? And he felt that absolutely pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, he does feel like there has been greater productivity because there's fewer distractions, and the engineers feel greater autonomy around managing their time. And they were able to add value in a way that the company was able to recognize the efficiency of the way that they were now working, and is looking to increase the size of their team. The last thing that he mentioned was he's really enjoying being a part of this team because the company actually gets out of the way of the engineer. They're not forcing or coercing you to work in a particular way, and instead give the flexibility to work from wherever, but also it's less about the how you are working, but that you are ultimately delivering. And for that, you are celebrated. All right. Akinsola, are you back? You still look frozen to me. All right. Dima, it sounds like, okay, you work for Cisco and you're staying remote till January. So what happens in January? Do you all go back to in-person co-location, or is it a hybrid? And for anyone else, have you tried the hybrid, and how are you able to still keep culture and productivity managed between the two? Thank you, Dima. Yep, culture is definitely key to sustaining it, and trying to avoid burnout for a lot of people who are feeling quite stressed out by it. Let's see who else is in the room. Hmm. Anybody else want to share a little bit about what they're doing in their teams? Akinsola, you don't look frozen anymore. Do you want to try speaking? Mm, dear. Okay. All right. Got it. I see from Dima's comment. There are multiple scenarios depending on country, local rules, and the pandemic situation. And I'm sure that even that isn't certain, right? And so we've seen a second wave in many countries that we're all operating in. And so what might have been tested might be retracted. And so there seems to be a lot of fluidity. And that's actually one of the things that we've seen from a lot of our customers, where in as much as they're wanting to at least give the option to a lot of their staff to be in a shared space should they so choose to, there's not really much of a commitment around when that is required, only because of the fluidity of the pandemic and the cases. Um, I'm feeling like I want to pick on people only because we have about 15 minutes left and I would love to hear more. Samantha, are you remote, hybrid? Is the team distributed? Curious to hear from you. All right. Ezine, I see that you're in the room. Um, you're not getting a lot of questions, and I would hate for me to just sort of be a talking head. Um, Okay, thank you, Raj. Yes, some engagement. If you just introduce yourselves, we're here at this conference. Let's make use of the time that we have. Okay, Raj, you're at Denton's and you don't go back until March. And is it sort of like Dima where it sort of will depend on what's happening in your local city, with regards to whether you have to go and to what extent is it about your role or the function? How are they approaching the going back? And is it hybrid? Because I think this notion, it just feels like hybrid is going to become the more common state, allowing teams to select whether they work remotely or not. Interesting, Chris. And I'm curious, an unavoidable meaning like emergencies, or is this tied to? So Chris says his team is remote for now and only comes around for unavoidable meetings. And that is that more sort of like crisis meetings, or maybe a little bit about what ninth binary does in the context of what would drive an in-person meeting, and then how are you thinking about building culture, and are your teams feeling as much productive or even more productive in their now remote culture, versus before? All right. We've about 13 minutes to go. I truly appreciate your time and and listening. We've had some technical difficulties, and my apologies for those. Perhaps this allows you to now go catch the end of another session. I'm just glad that you were able to hear me given the previous technical issues. But if you are interested in the content that I shared earlier, I'm happy to share that as a link. Just find me in the, I guess, in the conference, and I'm happy to share the presentation. But certainly, this last push on think about it very intentionally about how you are approaching culture, productivity, structure, and process. Set up the different work streams because you don't have to do all those things. Remember, there's stages to the journey. And then how are you creating the intention around some quick tactical things that you can employ? How are you setting your managers up for success in terms of the muscles that they have to be able to practice? And then lastly, how do you factor that as you think about growing your company or scaling your company? Thinking along the lines of culture, productivity, process, and structure. Thank you very much. I'm going to now leave the session. And again, my name is Wambui Kinya, and I am with Andela and happy to engage should you so choose to. Thank you.